The stars were cold and silent as the Vornak 7 drifted through deep space. It was a small scout vessel, sleek and fast, built for stealth and speed. Its mission was simple: scan uncharted sectors for signs of new life or unknown threats. Sector. Delta 9 had been quiet for centuries, just empty space and drifting debris from old wars. But now something new floated in that silence. A small escape pod, battered and damaged, tumbled slowly through the void. It gave off no power readings, no movement inside. Just an old hulk of metal, lost in the dark. But it was not empty. Inside the pod, a man sat strapped into the pilot's seat. His face was calm. His eyes were closed. He looked like he was sleeping. Blood stained his shirt, but the wound on his side had already begun to seal itself. His name was Dan. He did not move for hours. The oxygen recycler hummed softly. The lights flickered. Outside, the stars passed by like distant ghosts. Then a signal came. A Zalari scout ship had picked up the pod's faint heat signature. They sent out a hail. No reply. That was strange. Most pods had emergency beacons. This one had none. 2 Zalari officers boarded the pod with caution. Their suits gleamed under the light of their helmet visors. They scanned the interior. Life signs 1. Human. They opened the hatch to the cockpit and found Dan still seated, breathing slow and even. "He's alive," said one of them, speaking in clipped Zalari tones. "Barely," replied the other. "How long has he been here?" They checked the systems. The pod had no logs, no navigation data, no ID tags, nothing. Dan's eyes fluttered open. "Where am I?" he asked in rough Zalari. The 2 officers exchanged glances. Humans were rare, this far out. And this one spoke their language? "You are aboard a Zalari vessel," said one. "You have been recovered." Dan nodded slowly. His voice was soft. "Tired. Thank you." He tried to stand, but winced and sat back down. "Do not move," said one officer. "You are injured." Dan smiled weakly. "I've had worse." The officers called in a medical team. Dan was taken, aboard the Vornak 7-1, where he was placed in a sterile observation room. The crew watched him closely. Humans were unpredictable. Dangerous, some said. Others believed they were just primitive beings trying to survive. Dan sat quietly on the medical bench. He looked around at the walls, the ceiling, the floor. He touched the metal with his fingers. His eyes narrowed slightly as if he were listening to something beneath the surface. A doctor entered, followed by a security officer. "We need to run tests," said the doctor. Dan shook his head. "No tests. You were floating in space, in a broken pod. We need to know what happened." Dan looked at them both. His gaze was calm, steady. "It's not important." "Not important," said the security officer. "You could have died." Dan smiled again. A small, knowing smile. "I wouldn't have." The doctor frowned. "You're lucky to be alive." Dan stood up slowly. Luck had nothing to do with it. There was a pause. The doctor looked at the security officer. "He's refusing scans." "Then we'll take them without his permission," said the officer. Dan turned to face them fully. "You won't." The officer stepped forward. "You don't get to choose." Dan tilted his head slightly as if considering something. "You should let me go." "Why would we do that?" Dan looked past them toward the window. Outside, the stars burned cold and bright. "Because if you don't, you won't live long enough to regret it." The officer laughed. "Are you threatening us?" Dan's expression didn't change. "I'm giving you a chance." The officer reached for his weapon. Dan moved. He didn't look fast. There was no blur, no sudden motion. He simply wasn't where he had been a moment ago. The officer blinked. Dan was behind him. Before anyone could react, Dan grabbed the officer's wrist and twisted. The gun clattered to the floor. Dan leaned close. "Run," he whispered. Then he struck. Not hard, not violently. Just a single punch to the officer's side. But the man crumpled like he'd been hit by a freight train. The doctor screamed. Dan turned to her. "Stay down," She backed away quickly, hands raised. Dan walked calmly out of the room. The door slid shut behind him. On the bridge of the Vornak 7-0, alarms began to blare. Intruder alert, unidentified breach. Dan moved through the halls like a shadow. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked straight toward the core of the ship. The crew tried to stop him. Stun batons, sonic pulses, even gunfire. Nothing worked. Bullets bounced off his skin. Energy blasts left no mark. When they tackled him, he moved like water, slipping free and knocking them unconscious with a single touch. He reached the engine room. The core pulsed with blue light. Dan placed his hand against the outer shell. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the entire ship shuddered. Systems began to fail. Lights flickered, doors locked, comms went dead. Dan stepped back. He looked at the core one last time. Then he turned and walked to the nearest airlock. He opened it manually. Space stared back at him. Without hesitation, Dan stepped out, into the void. The Vornak 7 spun slowly, behind him crippled and helpless. Dan floated in the black, arms at his sides. His suit sealed itself automatically. Oxygen flowed. Temperature adjusted. He looked ahead. Far in the distance, something waited. An old mining station. Abandoned. Forgotten. Dan smiled. Home, he whispered, and he began to drift toward it. The Vornak 7 was silent. Drifting in space, its lights flickered weakly. The ship had power, but no life signs on the bridge. No movement, no voices. Just cold metal and the soft hum of failing systems. Inside, the halls were empty. Officers lay unconscious or worse. Some slumped against walls, others sprawled across the floor. All had been taken down with precision and silence. One Zalari officer stirred. His name was Kalen. He groaned as he sat up, his vision blurry. He looked around, confused. "Report," he said weakly into his comms. No reply. He pushed himself to his feet and stumbled toward the command console. It was dark, locked out. The ship's core was still active, but everything else was scrambled. Kalen reached for the emergency override. Before he could press it, a voice came through his earpiece. "Commander Kalen," said a sharp voice. "Status report." It was High Commander Virek of the Zalari Defense Fleet. Kalen cleared his throat. "We were attacked," he said, "by the human. Dan." There was a pause. "Describe what happened." "He was on board. We tried to scan him. He refused. Then he moved. Fast. Too fast." Another pause. "You are saying one human took down your entire crew?" Kalen looked at the bodies around him. "Yes." A long silence followed. Then Virek spoke again. "Send coordinates. We're sending a strike team." Dan floated through space, moving slowly toward the abandoned mining station. He didn't rush. He had time. Behind him, the Vornak 7 grew smaller. Ahead, the station loomed like a dead moon. Its surface was cracked. Most lights were off. It had been abandoned for centuries, but Dan knew it wasn't empty. He reached the docking bay. It opened automatically as he approached. The system recognized him. As he stepped inside, dust swirled in the low gravity. Lights flickered to life, dim and slow. The station creaked like an old house waking from sleep. Dan walked through the halls, his boots echoing softly. He reached the central control room. It was large and round, filled with broken terminals and rusted machines. In the center stood a tall console covered in dust. Dan placed his hand on it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the room lit up. Machines whirred. Lights flashed. Monitors blinked to life, showing data in languages no Zalari would recognize. The station was waking up. Dan closed his eyes. Memories surged through him. Not his memories. The station's. It remembered being built by humans. Not just any humans, the ones before the wars. The ones who knew how to build things that lasted. It remembered when the aliens came. The first contact had not been peaceful. The Zalari had come looking for resources. They found humans instead, and they saw them as threats. The station had once been a warning post, a place where watchers like Dan were trained. Hidden, kept safe until the galaxy showed its true face. Now, the station was ready again. Dan opened his eyes. "I'm back," he whispered. The Zalari strike team arrived within hours. 4 ships dropped out of hyperspace near the station. They were sleek and deadly, painted black with glowing red lines. Each carried a full squad of elite soldiers. Their mission: retrieve Dan or eliminate him. Commander Virek watched from orbit. "This one human has caused too much damage already," he said. "We end this now." The strike team landed silently. Their boots clicked on the metal floors as they moved in formation. They swept the lower levels first. Empty. No sign of life. They moved upward. Still nothing. Then, near the central control room, their sensors picked up movement. "Contact ahead," whispered one soldier. They raised their weapons. The door slid open. Darkness. They stepped inside. Lights flickered. Then, movement. A blur. A body hit the floor. Before the others could react, another fell. Gunfire erupted. Lasers cut through the air, but nothing hit the target. Dan moved like shadow. He didn't fight like a normal man. He didn't dodge bullets, he made them miss. He didn't block attacks, and he avoided them before they happened. One soldier managed to fire a stun pulse. It hit Dan square in the chest. Nothing. Dan looked at the soldier. "Nice try," he said. He walked forward. The soldier raised his weapon. Dan grabbed it and crushed it in his hand like paper. The soldier backed away, stunned. Dan stepped close. "One chance," he said. "Run." The soldier turned and fled. Dan let him go. Back on the command ship, alarms blared. "Team is down," said a communications officer. "Only one survivor." Commander Virek clenched his jaw. "Send more troops." "No," said the surviving soldier over comms. "You won't win." Virek frowned. "What do you mean?" The soldier's voice was shaking. "He's not human." Dan returned to the control room. The station was almost fully online now. Power flowed through ancient wires. Systems rebooted after centuries of silence. He walked to the main console. His fingers danced over the keys. The station responded. Deep beneath the surface, something began to wake. A massive machine rumbled to life. Gears turned. Doors opened. Dust blew away as heat returned. Dan smiled. "It's time," he said. Back on the Zalari command ship, the surviving soldier was brought aboard. He was pale, shaking. "Tell me what you saw," said Virek. The soldier looked up. "He wasn't fighting us," he said. "He was testing us." "Testing?" "He didn't kill most of us. He knocked us out, like he wanted to see what we'd do." Virek narrowed his eyes. "And what did he find?" The soldier swallowed hard. "That we weren't ready." Virek stood. "Prepare the fleet. If one human can do this, we cannot risk more." The officer hesitated. "Sir, maybe we should talk first." Virek shook his head. "No. We destroy the station. And him with it." Dan felt the attack before he saw it. Zalari warships entered orbit. Missiles locked on the station. He stood calmly in the control room. On the monitors, countdowns began. 5 minutes. 4. 3. Dan closed his eyes. He reached out, not with his hands, but with his mind. The station responded. Power surged. Shields rose. Missiles launched. They struck the station. Explosions rocked the hull, but the shields held. Dan opened his eyes. He pressed a final key. The station fired back. Not with lasers, not with missiles, with sound. A deep, resonant frequency rippled through space. The Zalari ships shuddered. Systems failed. Engines died. Comms went silent. One by one, the ships drifted helplessly. Dan watched them fall. He turned back to the screen. More messages came in, from other worlds, other systems. Humans reporting strange changes, memories returning, abilities awakening. Dan read them all. He smiled. They're waking up. Far away on Earth, a woman named Lucy sat in her small apartment. She was watching the news. Reports of a battle in space. A human fought off an alien fleet. Lucy frowned. Something stirred in her mind. She touched her temple. Her eyes glowed faintly. Then she blinked. She looked at her hands. "What was that?" she whispered. Outside, the wind blew, and somewhere deep inside her, something ancient began to stir. Dan stood in the heart of the station as it pulsed with life. The ancient systems hummed beneath his feet, warm and awake after centuries of silence. He could feel them, not just hear or see them, but feel them like a heartbeat. The station was no longer just metal and wires. It was alive in its own way, and so was he. He moved to the central console, fingers dancing over keys that hadn't been touched in hundreds of years. The screen lit up, showing maps, schematics, and long-forgotten data. Words in old human languages scrolled across the display. Some Dan barely remembered, others he had never seen before, but his mind understood. A voice echoed in his thoughts, soft and familiar. "You are not alone." Dan closed his eyes. The words weren't his. They came from the station itself, or maybe from something deeper, something built into him long ago. He opened his eyes and tapped a final command. Across the galaxy, hidden signals woke up. They traveled through deep space, bouncing off dead satellites, buried relays, forgotten stations. They reached places humans had gone to hide, to escape, to forget who they were, and in those places, people began to change. On Earth, Lucy sat at her kitchen table, staring at her coffee. It had been 2 days since she first felt the strange pulse in her head. Since then, things had gotten worse, or better, depending on how you looked at it. She could remember things she had never learned. She knew how to fix broken machines without touching them. She could hear whispers in the wind. Her dreams were full of stars and voices that called her name. Tonight she couldn't sleep. She stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights blinked like stars fallen to earth. Then her phone buzzed. It wasn't normal. The screen turned white, then filled with symbols she didn't recognize. She gasped as pain shot through her skull. Images flashed in her mind. Ships, weapons, training halls, voices calling out commands in perfect unison. She dropped to her knees, and when she looked up again, her eyes glowed faintly in the dark. "I remember," she whispered. Back on the mining station, Dan watched. As reports streamed in, humans waking up, some on distant colonies, some hiding in plain sight, others still asleep waiting for the signal. He smiled. "Good," he said. The station's power core flared brighter. Deep inside, machines stirred. Doors sealed for centuries cracked open. Dust blew away as heat returned to forgotten halls. Dan walked down a long hallway, boots echoing against cold steel. He stopped at a large door marked with faded letters. "Watcher storage, authorized personnel only." He placed his hand on the scanner. The door groaned and slid open. Inside, rows of pods lined the walls. Each one held a person in stasis, men and women frozen in time, their bodies preserved by ancient tech. Dan walked between them, reading names etched into glass. Some were friends, some were strangers. All were like him, sleeping, waiting. He reached the end of the room and pressed a button on the wall. A low hum filled the chamber. One by one, the pods began to open. Steam burst out. Lights flickered. Eyes blinked open. Dan stood at the center watching as they rose. A man stepped forward first. His name was Carl. He looked around, confused. "Where am I?" Dan smiled. "Home." Carl looked at him, then at the others. "What happened?" Dan's voice was calm. "We slept too long. Now we wake up." More of them joined him. Men and women in simple clothes, blinking in the light. Some staggered. Some fell to their knees. But all of them were changing. Their minds expanded. Memories returned. Powers awakened. Dan raised his voice. The galaxy thought we were weak. They tested us. They hurt us. They tried to control us. He looked at each face. But now, we remember who we are. Silence filled the room. Then one by one they nodded. Carl stepped forward. What do we do now? Dan looked toward the stars beyond the station's outer hull. We show them. Meanwhile, back aboard the Zalari command ship, Commander Virek stared at the latest report. His face was pale. Another human, he muttered. Yes, said his officer. On a colony world. She attacked an entire security force. Didn't even use weapons, just looked at them. Virek clenched his jaw. They're spreading. The officer hesitated. There's more. Virek looked up. More what? A message was sent. Broadcast across every known channel. No translation needed. Everyone heard it. What did it say? The officer swallowed hard. We tried peace. Now we try justice. Virek stood. Prepare the fleet. We need to contain this before it spreads further. The officer frowned. Contain? Sir, we barely survived the last attack. What if we can't win this? Virek turned to him. Then we make sure they never leave their worlds. Dan stood on the observation deck of the station, looking out at the stars. Behind him, more watchers gathered. They were learning fast, their abilities growing stronger. Lucy's signal had been picked up. So had dozens more. Dan turned to Carl. We need to find the others. Carl nodded. How? Dan pointed at the sky. They'll come to us. Just then, a new alert flashed on the main screen. Incoming ships, Zalari warships. Dan smiled. They found us first. Carl looked at the screen. You think they're here to talk? Dan shook his head. No. They're here to finish what they started. Carl looked at him. Should we run? Dan turned to face him fully. No. We stand. Carl smiled. Then let's show them what we can do. As the Zalari fleet approached, the station powered up. Lights blazed. Weapons systems warmed. Defenses rose. Dan stepped onto the command platform. He reached out with his mind. The station responded. Energy surged through its veins, and far away, on Earth, Lucy stood on a rooftop, arms raised. She reached out too. Across the planet, others felt her call. They answered. In cities, in forests, in oceans, in deserts, humans woke up, and for the first time in centuries, they remembered who they truly were. Not victims, not prey, watchers, protectors, warriors. And now? Now they were ready. The Zalari fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation. 6 warships, sleek and deadly. Their hulls gleamed under the cold light of distant stars. Each carried enough firepower to reduce a planet to ash. Commander Virek stood on the bridge of the Zalarian, his hands gripping the rail as he stared at the screen. There it was. The station, dark, silent, waiting. Behind him, officers moved quickly between consoles, checking weapons, shields, and targeting systems. Sir, said the tactical officer, we have movement inside the station. Virek narrowed his eyes. They're awake. Yes. And more are arriving. A new image appeared on the main screen, blurry at first, then clearer. Figures standing on the outer hull of the station. Humans. They weren't wearing armor or carrying weapons. They were just there, standing in space like it was nothing. Virek took a slow breath. Begin the attack. Dan felt the moment the first missiles launched. He stood on the observation deck with Carl and the others. They didn't flinch, didn't move. They just watched. The missiles streaked through space, glowing red-hot as they closed in. Then, without a word, Dan raised one hand. The station responded. A pulse of energy rippled outward, invisible but powerful. The missiles exploded mid-flight, not because they hit something, because they simply stopped existing. Carl turned to Dan. You did that? Dan nodded. I didn't even try. Across the station, other watchers reached out with their minds. The second wave of missiles vanished before they could fire. The Zalari ships hesitated. Then came the third wave. Lasers this time. Bright green. Beams sliced through the void, aimed at the station's core. Dan stepped forward, and the lasers bent. They curved around the station like water flowing around stone. One beam struck a nearby asteroid and vaporized it instantly, but not a single shot touched the station. Carl looked at Dan. That's not possible, Dan smiled. We were built for this. Inside the Zalarian, panic spread. Shields are holding, said the tactical officer. But we can't lock onto them. Commander Virek slammed his fist on the console. They're ghosts. His communications officer spoke up. Sir, we're receiving a message. And from who? The humans. Virek frowned. Play it. The voice that filled the bridge was calm, cold. You tested us, you hurt us, you tried to control us. Now you will learn what happens when you make an enemy of humanity. The message ended. Silence followed. Then the station moved. Not physically, mentally. Every Zalari on every ship felt it, a pressure behind their eyes, a whisper in their minds. Some screamed, some fell to their knees, some just stared into space, paralyzed. Virek clutched his head. What is this? Carl's voice echoed in their thoughts. This is justice. Back on Earth, Lucy stood on the rooftop, arms stretched wide. She wasn't alone. Others had gathered around her, men and women who had just awakened. Their eyes glowed faintly. They reached out together. Across the world, machines began to hum. Power grids surged. Satellites realigned. Defense systems rebooted. In military bases, soldiers found their weapons locking down. In government buildings, computers displayed messages in glowing text. We are awake. We remember. We will not be controlled. Lucy opened her eyes. We're not hiding anymore, she whispered. Around her, the others nodded. They lifted off the ground. Not flying. Floating. Like they belonged to the sky now. And then, they rose higher and higher until they vanished into the clouds. Back at the station, Dan watched as the Zalari fleet broke apart. One ship drifted lifelessly, another fired blindly, hitting nothing. The Zalarian remained intact, but barely. Virek staggered to his feet. Pull back, he shouted. The pilot hesitated. We can't. Our engines are locked. What do you mean, locked? The pilot pointed at the screen. Dan floated outside the station, arms at his sides. He raised one hand, and the Zalarian stopped moving. Engines dead. Weapons offline. Comms silent. Dan entered the ship's mind like it was a dream. He walked through its systems, shutting everything down piece by piece. He reached the bridge. The crew stared at him in horror. He wasn't floating outside. He was standing in front of them. How? Virek started. Dan held up a finger. Don't speak. He looked at each of them. This isn't about killing you. Virek swallowed hard. Then what is it about? Dan stepped closer. It's about making sure your people understand what they've done. He reached out and touched Virek's forehead. Virek gasped. Memories flooded his mind. Not his own. Dan's. He saw Earth as it once was. He saw the first contact. He saw the lies told to justify fear. He saw humans being hunted, tested, studied, and he saw why they had hidden. Because they were too powerful, too dangerous, too real. When Dan pulled away, Virek collapsed to his knees. He looked up at Dan. You're not monsters. Dan shook his head. No, but we won't let anyone treat us like prey again. Dan returned to the station. Carl met him at the door. They'll tell their people, Carl said. Dan nodded. They already have. Outside, the remaining Zalari. Ships fled, broken, scared, changed. Dan looked at the stars. There's more, he said. Carl frowned. More what? Dan turned to him. More of us. More enemies. More tests. Carl nodded slowly. So what do we do now? Dan smiled. We show them who we really are. Far away, on a colony world, a young man named Jason sat in his small room. He was watching the news. Reports of the battle. Of what happened to the Zalari. Jason blinked. Something stirred in his chest. He stood up, went to the window, looked at the stars, and for the first time in his life, he knew who he was. Across the galaxy, the message spread. It wasn't sent through radio waves or data packets. It was felt, in minds and dreams, in the quiet moments when people thought they were alone. The humans had awakened, and they were not what anyone thought they were. On Zalari Prime, panic gripped the capital city. The Council of Elders held an emergency session behind closed doors, surrounded by guards and screens filled with reports. Commander Virek stood before them, still shaken from what he had seen. They are not just powerful, he said. They are something else entirely. One of the elders narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Virek took a deep breath. I touched one of their minds. I saw things, memories that weren't mine, histories we never knew. They've been hiding for centuries, maybe longer. Another elder spoke, voice trembling. Are they going to attack us? Virek looked at each of them. No, he said. Not yet. There was silence. Then another screen lit up. A new message had appeared across every known network. No translation needed. Everyone understood. We tried peace. Now we try justice. The council chamber fell into chaos. Dan stood on the observation deck of the mining station watching the stars. Behind him, Carl entered. We're getting more signals, he said. Humans waking up all over. Dan nodded. They'll come. Carl stepped beside him. You think Earth will be ready for this? Dan's gaze didn't waver. They won't have a choice. On Earth, the changes were already happening. In cities, people began to vanish from security footage. Not kidnapped. Just gone. In forests, animals grew calm around certain humans, as if they sensed something ancient. In oceans, divers reported strange lights beneath the surface, people walking on the sea floor without drowning. And in the skies, people flew, not in ships, with their bodies. Lucy stood atop a mountain, arms outstretched as wind swirled around her. She lifted off the ground, rising slowly into the clouds. Below, others followed. Some wore normal clothes. Some glowed faintly. All of them had the same look in their eyes. Freedom. Lucy turned to the group. We need to find the others, she said, before someone tries to stop us. One of the watchers, a man named Jason, frowned. Who would stop us? We're not attacking anyone. Lucy looked toward the horizon. That doesn't matter, she said. They'll see us as a threat anyway. Jason nodded slowly. So what do we do? Lucy smiled. We show them who we really are. Back in space, Dan watched as more humans arrived at the station. They came from different worlds, different backgrounds. Some remembered everything. Others were still confused, but all of them were changing. Dan gathered them in the main hall. Hundreds of watchers now stood together looking at him. He raised his voice so all could hear. The galaxy has always feared us, he said. They called us primitive, weak, dangerous, but they never understood us. He looked at each face. We were made to protect, to watch, to wait. He paused. But we waited too long. Murmurs passed through the crowd. Dan continued. We let them test us, study us, control us. We played small, we hid who we were. He stepped forward. No more. Silence filled the room. Then Carl raised his hand. What happens next? Dan smiled. We begin again. On Zalari Prime, the council issued a formal decree. All human colonies were to be placed under observation. Trade with human worlds was suspended. Military forces were ordered to prepare for possible conflict. Commander Virek stood outside the council chambers, watching the sky. His aide approached. "Sir, what do we do now?" Virek looked at him. "We make contact." The aide blinked. "But the council said—" "I don't care what the council says," Virek interrupted. "If we don't talk to them now, we'll lose our chance forever." He turned and walked away. "I'm going to Earth." Dan received the signal hours later. A single ship. No weapons. No escort. Just one Zalari on board. He stood on the command deck with Carl. "You think it's a trap?" Carl asked. Dan shook his head. "No, he wants to talk." Carl raised an eyebrow. "And you trust him?" Dan looked at the incoming ship. "I trust that he's afraid." Virek landed on the station alone. As he stepped onto the metal floor, he found himself surrounded. Watchers. Dozens of them. Standing silently. Watching. Dan walked forward. "You came alone," he said. Virek nodded. "I wanted to see you in person." Dan crossed his arms. "For what reason?" Virek looked around. "I want to understand," he said. "You're not what we thought you were." Dan tilted his head. "And what did you think we were?" Virek hesitated. "Primitive, violent, a danger." Dan smiled. "And now?" Virek met his gaze. "I think we underestimated you." Dan stepped closer. "You did more than that." Virek swallowed hard. "I know." There was a long pause. Then Dan extended his hand. "If you want to understand, start here." Virek looked at the hand. Then he reached out, and when their hands touched, Virek saw it all. Human history, human power, human truth. When he pulled away, he staggered. His eyes were wide. Dan caught him. "You see now," he said softly. Virek nodded slowly. "I see." Back on Earth, Lucy sat with a group of newly awakened watchers. They were in a hidden base beneath the ocean. One of them, a young woman named Nina, looked nervous. "What happens if they try to fight us?" she asked. Lucy looked at her calmly. "They won't." Nina frowned. "How do you know?" Lucy smiled. "Because they finally understand what we are." Carl's voice echoed through their minds. "They remember." Lucy nodded. "Yes. And now we decide what comes next." Dan stood with Virek on the observation deck. Outside, stars burned cold and bright. Virek broke the silence. "What do you want?" he asked. Dan looked at him. "Peace." Virek raised an eyebrow. "Just like that?" Dan shook his head. "No. Not peace built on lies. Not peace bought with fear." He turned to face Virek fully. "Real peace. Built on truth." Virek studied him. "And if we can't give you that?" Dan smiled. "Then we'll build it ourselves." Far away on a distant colony world, a boy named Leo stared at the night sky. He was only 10, but tonight, something inside him woke up. He reached out with his mind, and the stars answered. The galaxy was quiet, not peaceful, just waiting. After the battle with the Zalari, after the messages, after the awakenings, no one knew what would come next. The Watchers had revealed themselves, not as conquerors, not as gods, but as something the galaxy had never seen before. Humans were not weak. They were not primitive. They were not alone. They were awake. And now, they were free. Dan stood on the edge of a floating city above Earth's atmosphere. It wasn't built by governments or corporations. It rose from the minds of the awakened, shaped by thought, powered by will. Behind him, Carl walked up and looked out at the stars. "They're still watching," Carl said. Dan nodded. "I know." Across space, Zalari ships remained in orbit, around human worlds. They didn't attack, they didn't leave. They waited. So did the other species. Some sent diplomats, some sent spies, others simply observed. But none acted. Because now they understood. Humans weren't hiding anymore. Carl turned to Dan. "What do we do now?" Dan smiled. "We build." Carl raised an eyebrow. Build what? Dan pointed to the sky. A future. On Earth, life changed slowly. Cities still ran. People still worked. Children still played, but things were different. People who had once been ordinary now carried memories from another time. Skills they had never learned, powers they didn't understand. Lucy walked through the streets of a small town, her presence unnoticed by most. She stopped at a school. Inside, a boy sat at his desk, staring out the window. His name was Leo. He was 10 years old. He looked at the sky like he could hear it calling him. Lucy stepped inside. Leo turned toward her. He didn't speak, but she heard him in her mind. I feel it. Lucy smiled. I know. She walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. You're not alone anymore. Leo blinked. Then he smiled too. Back on the station, Dan gathered the watchers. They stood in the central hall, hundreds of them. Men and women from across the stars. Some had lived normal lives. Some had been lost. All had found each other now. Dan spoke clearly. For too long, we let others decide who we were. He looked at each face. They called us dangerous, unpredictable, weak. He paused. But we are none of those things. He raised his voice. We are the first, the last, the protectors, the builders. He stepped forward. And now, we begin again. The room filled with quiet agreement. Some nodded. Some closed their eyes. Some reached out with their minds, touching the thoughts of others like threads in a great tapestry. Carl stepped beside Dan. What about the others? He asked. The ones who don't understand us yet? Dan looked at him. We show them. Carl frowned. How? Dan smiled. With kindness, with truth, with strength. He turned back to the group. We offer peace. We share knowledge. We help where we can. He looked up. But if anyone tries to control us again, he let the silence settle. We remind them why they should have run when they had the chance. Across the galaxy, humans began to change the world, not through war, through creation. In orbit above dead planets, new cities formed. On barren moons, forests grew. In forgotten ruins, ancient tech came back online, and everywhere, humans helped. Others, they taught aliens how to heal without medicine, how to fly without ships, how to think beyond limits. Some species welcomed them, others feared them, but all watched them. Because for the first time, humans were not asking for a place in the galaxy. They were offering one. Commander Virek stood on the bridge of the Zalarian, looking at the data reports. Every day more humans arrived at the station. More watchers woke up. More messages spread. Peace offers, technology blueprints, healing methods. No demands, no threats, just help. Virek turned to his officer. Do you believe them? He asked. The officer hesitated. Believe what? Virek looked at the screen. That they only want peace. The officer studied the reports. I think they want something bigger than peace. Virek frowned. Like what? The officer met his gaze. Freedom. Virek was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. Maybe that's what we all need. Dan stood on the edge of a new world. It had no name yet. It was young, untouched, waiting. Behind him, Lucy landed softly. You brought me here for a reason, she said. Dan nodded. This planet has never known war. He looked at her. It's going to be our home. Lucy smiled. Our new beginning. Dan extended his hand. Will you help me shape it? Lucy took his hand. Always. Around them, more watchers arrived. Floating down from the sky like stars made flesh. They stepped onto the soil, and the ground pulsed beneath them, as if the planet itself recognized them. Lucy looked at Dan. What happens now? Dan looked at the horizon. Now we grow. Far away, on a distant moon, a child named Nina stared at the night sky. She was only 12. But tonight, she felt something, though. Pull a call. She raised her hand and the stars answered.